Hello everybody, and welcome to this lecture. Today I want to talk about how to write your introduction. Uh, um, this introduction clearly is a part of every type of APA paper. The ones we've been concentrating on, or the type we've been concentrating on in this course, are APA literature review papers, but as you move forward and take experimental psychology and perhaps go on to graduate school and write a thesis or dissertation, you will write an APA experimental paper. You've been learning about that a little bit by focusing upon, for instance, the method section and the results section, and you'll apply those when you get to experimental psychology. When you think about writing your introduction, you almost have to see it as a mini version of your whole paper. In fact, if I could just back up a little bit and give you a little picture for you to see. When we look at an APA literature review paper, the running head, which you've probably observed as you've looked at typical papers, the running head is the little series of a bunch of words that's up in the left-hand corner of every page. The running head is the shortest version of your paper. It is a shortened version of your title. So almost think of the running head as kind of your paper in the shortest possible version. Then the full title would be the second version of your paper. It's a little longer, it's a little more detailed. Then your abstract, which you'll write on the next piece of paper or the next page in your paper, is a little more elaborate. It tells some more details. And then I want you to think of the introduction as the fourth telling of your paper. It's kind of longer than the abstract. It introduces your topic, and in some ways the introduction should have pretty much everything that's going to happen in the paper. And then finally, the fifth version of your paper is the body of the paper itself. So I don't know if that helps, but essentially what you're doing with APA style is APA style focuses on clarity and trying to be precise, and so it has this kind of system of telling or writing your paper in increasingly longer formats. Number one being the running head, number two being the title itself, number three being the abstract, and number four, which we're going to concentrate on today, is your introduction. It's a little longer, and then finally your paper itself. So hopefully that helps as you move forward. I want to go through and talk to you about a bunch of steps in terms of how to write your introduction. The first and really important aspect of not only your introduction but your entire paper is to ask yourself, what is my thesis statement? What is the statement in a sentence or two that pretty much describes what I'm trying to do in this paper? Now, it's important to put some time and thought into coming up with this thesis statement. I think that once you can do this, once you have this one or two sentence kind of statement on what this paper is all about, what are you doing with this paper, it really goes a long way toward helping you write the paper. If you know what you're doing, then it's much easier to do this. I think a mistake that some people make is that they don't know the thesis statement. They start writing their paper and it's all over the place. In order to prevent that from happening, I think that it's probably best for you to put some time into a good thesis statement. Now, your thesis statement can be stated in any number of ways. We'll talk about some of those. But remember, the goal is to be clear and to be precise and to say something about the direction of your paper. Now, the easiest way to put your thesis statement is simply to write, in this paper, I will blah, 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 blah. It's the most common. It is simple and direct, and so as far as APA style, that wants precision and direction, it's a good way to start. But we do have to cloud the issues a little bit here. While it's the simplest and most common, it's also not very creative, and perhaps there's a more effective way that you could do this. As I often tell students, I think it's best to at least begin as you write your introduction or you write your paper, to begin that way, to simply, after you come up with your thesis statement, to write it down in your introduction. In this paper, I will do this, particularly in your first draft, and then maybe later on, as you're rewriting the first draft to your second or third draft, you may want to think of a creative way to revise it, to put it in another format, simply as a way of being a little more creative and to providing a little more of a hook. What you want to do certainly is avoid saying or writing, "This paper will do blah, blah, blah." First of all, papers can't do anything. So this is a classic example of the million-dollar term, anthropomorphizing. This is when we give inanimate objects human qualities. So the desk did this, the paper does that, and so make sure you avoid that. Rather, it's much better to say, "I will," not "this paper will." Now, the thesis statement doesn't have to be the first sentence or two. Often it is, but it doesn't have to be. And perhaps you should, again, start off that way with your introduction. In this paper, I will. But then later on, perhaps see if there's a better first sentence, and we'll talk about that here just in a little bit. Now, step number 2, once you have your thesis statement, you want to ask yourself, okay, what are the main points that are going to support that thesis statement? And again, I think the best way to do this is to come up with an outline of your paper. Think about this. You're going to state the main idea, the thesis statement, and then as you seek to unpack or show evidence for that thesis statement, what are the main points? And again, you want to probably aim between 3 and 5. What are the main points that you'll make in this paper that will provide the unfolding of your thesis statement, evidence of your thesis statement? One of the things you certainly want to do is to avoid making your 3 to 4 points. Remember, with this paper in particular, you have 4 journal articles that you're using. A big mistake you should avoid making is to make those 3, 4, 5 points to be article specific. So for instance, your thesis statement, you say something, and then the first point comes from the first article, and then the second point comes to the second article, and the third main point comes from the third article. You really want to avoid that. That is an indication to any reader that your paper isn't truly integrated. You haven't processed and put into a form in which you're integrating and comparing and contrasting your articles. So that's one thing you should try and avoid. What are the main points? But make sure that those main points are not article specific. Now, one of your points could be taken from 2 articles or from 1 article, but it shouldn't be a list of points that merely reflect the list of 4 articles that you have. Always seek to do your best to integrate. Step number 3 is to ask a bunch of questions of yourself. Once you have your thesis statement and your main points, then really step back from that and ask yourself a series of questions. So again, once you have your thesis statement and your main points, ask a series of questions. So why do I want the reader to read this? Why is this topic important? Why is this topic interesting? Why would reading this paper be informative? What questions will be answered by this paper? What theoretical considerations are addressed by this paper? Honestly, why should anybody bother to write this paper? Your introduction and again your paper are going to answer those questions ideally. And if you think about it, as I referred to before, there's the running head, there's the title, there's the abstract, there's the introduction. These are ways in which, if I'm looking to read some article, the running head gives me an idea whether I am at all interested. Then the title fleshes in a little bit more. Then the abstract, again, is like a little mini paper. And then the introduction is where we want to hook people. We want to get them in. Now, again, we're writing an APA literature review paper in this course. We're learning how to do that. A research paper is going to be just pretty much the same thing, but it's going to add and answer a bunch of other questions. So for instance, what are the variables that I'm doing my research on? How do I operationally define those? What is the hypothesis of my research study? What is my methodology, and so on and so forth. But for now, these questions you ask yourself can help you write your introduction. And ideally, your introduction, by the time the person gets through reading the 3 or 4 paragraphs of your introduction, they should have a really, really good idea as to what your paper's about, what are the main points, and secondly, an indication that they have been hooked in, and there's a good reason why I want to go ahead and spend some time reading this paper. Now, step 4 is just once you've got your thesis statement, once you have your main points, once you once you have tried to come up with some questions, now the opportunity is to get a little creative. You've all heard, I'm sure, the famous statement, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. So once you have this all down, and perhaps in a second or third draft of this, ask yourself the question, does my introduction, number one, accurately convey the paper, and does it hook people in? Does it does it convey on behalf of the reader a desire, a want to read your whole paper? And with introductions, don't be afraid to be a little witty, even to be sometimes funny within limits. Remember, this is an academic paper, but so you're kind of trying to balance the clarity and objective nature of an academic paper on the one hand, with perhaps some clever way to begin. It's a balance. You always want to avoid sarcasm. Sarcasm doesn't translate well into writing, and so you should avoid that. But you do want to hook people in. Objective APA literature review papers do not have to be boring. They do not have to be absent of the personality or of the writer. But clearly you want to balance that, and so step number 4 is just really, how can I capture the reader's attention here by doing this? Now, a really good way to do this, and I would encourage you to with this lit review paper, to maybe think about doing this, is to begin your introduction with a series of questions. Maybe 1 question or 2 or 3 at the longest that you're going to be answering. And what's good about that is when you start off with questions, it's implied, and again, you should follow through on it, that, hey, so for instance, let's say I'm writing a paper on anorexia, and my first point is, my first sentence would be, is something like, is anorexia a disorder which always has X, Y, and Z in it, and then maybe even a follow-up question or two. That's a really nice hook, a series of questions, 1, 2, or 3, simply because the implication there is, hey, if you want the answer to these question or questions, keep reading. So, are serial killers born or are they created by their environment? Again, if you're writing a paper on serial killers, does the anxiety level of spouses influence their marital satisfaction? Do video games contribute to aggression? What parental characteristics produce the most well-adjusted children? It is a really, really good way, and I would encourage you not necessarily to write every lit review paper that you're going to have to write, but it is the perhaps the best way to think about capturing attention, and not only attention, but the promise that, hey, if this question is interesting to you, keep reading because this paper is going to answer it. Now, we get a little more fuzzy here. Step number 5 would be for you to think about the structure of your introduction. And so it's not only the introduction here, but clearly what I'm going to talk about here applies to your entire paper. So if you think about it, the first paragraph is going to maybe have that initial hook or questions and statement of your thesis with the general points that you're going to be talking about in this paper. You also want to make sure that your introduction follows the general format or structure of the rest of your paper. And a good rule here is to start broad and then narrow in. So for instance, if we could just use this example, when you first meet somebody, and once you exchange names, typically what we tend to do is we tend to start with some questions about each other that are relatively broad. And again, typically is, where are you from, or what do you do for a living, just general stuff. And clearly, as we get the answers to the general questions, we tend to ask follow-up questions that narrow and focus to some specifics about a person. And so if you can have that picture in mind with regard to your introduction and also your paper, start broad and narrow in. And one way that has been suggested with regard to this is imagine any of your paragraphs. So this would be the paragraphs of both your introduction, but also the paragraphs of your paper. If you thought about it in the following way, so for instance, in sentence number 1 of your paragraph, what's the general idea of what this paragraph is going to be about? And then sentence 2 is narrowing. Sentence 3, 4, and 5, you begin the forecast for the overall direction and the particulars. This is a good way to think about not only your introduction, which is what this slide really is going to focus upon, but beyond that, all the rest of the paragraphs of your paper. Now you may think, whoa, this is pretty intense, but you want to craft, again, each of your paragraphs with intention. And so it's helpful, just as a writer, to look at every paragraph in your paper and ask yourself general questions. Not that they all have to be exactly this way, but is there this general broadening, starting broad and then narrowing down to whatever I'm trying to say in this paragraph? Is that the general rule? If you can follow that, I promise you your writing is going to be better. Now, lastly, we want to think about transitioning. A good paper has these distinct paragraphs, and that's why we have paragraphs, is that a paragraph should be some kind of unit, some kind of unified, you're making a point in a paragraph. Some people have a difficult time coming up with paragraph breaks, but generally speaking, a paragraph should be a unit within the overall unit of your introduction or paper, and it should have a specific purpose to it. But very good writing attempts and puts effort into trying to transition between paragraphs. What you want is not a bunch of paragraphs which don't seem to flow into each other logically. You want paragraphs which at the end, the last sentence of each paragraph, again, is going to have a transition sentence which sets up the first sentence of the next paragraph. Now, you may think that this is going way overboard in terms of writing papers, but this is what a good, well-written paper is all about. The whole is crafted in a way which gives you an idea of the topic or answers a bunch of questions. And then the units, again, we're talking about paragraph units and even sentences, are thoughtfully written and presented to contribute to that idea of the whole. This flow of a well-written paper, or even a well-written anything, if it's done well, you almost don't notice, because as you're reading, there is just this kind of natural transitioning from one idea to another, or one again, sentence and paragraph to the other. This link or connection is almost like these hinges that go between paragraphs. Now, don't be discouraged at all with all of this writing process. If you find this challenging and difficult, I promise you, everybody does. I was listening to a podcast recently on one of my favorite writers and thinkers, a guy named Jordan Peterson, and he was talking about how, with his latest book, that there was not a sentence in that book that he didn't look at and in some sense rewrite 50, 60, 70 times. And that may strike us as crazy, but that book is very, very well written, and it shows, because when you think about not only the general idea of the book, but every sentence, and is there a way to write this better, 50 times. It doesn't mean that it's the perfect sentence, but it certainly probably was way better after looking at each sentence 50 times than the first time. Now, I'm not encouraging you to rewrite this paper 50 times. I'm just trying to I guess, encourage you that if you're a little frustrated with this process, if it strikes you as like, this is difficult, welcome to not only writing in general, but academic writing in particular. Everybody finds it difficult, so it's not just you. Now, I want to just talk a little bit about the format of your introduction. So an APA paper starts with the title page, and we'll get to that in our next unit. There's a title page. And then the next page is going to be your abstract, and only your abstract. The third page of every APA Lit Review paper starts with the introduction. Okay? Now, you don't write the word introduction. You simply rewrite the title of your paper centered in the middle at the top of the page. You don't use italics, you don't use capitals, you don't use a bigger font, a smaller font, you don't bold. Simply New Times Roman 12, your title of your paper restated and centered. And then you double space, and you don't leave extra space between your title and the first paragraph. You simply double space, indent 5 spaces, and then begin writing your paragraph. And again, does playing video games contribute to aggression? The entire paper is double spaced. You never want to have any extra spaces. With APA Lit Review papers, you use the Times New Roman font 12. You use 1-inch margins, and with a literature review paper with 4 journal articles, your introduction is probably going to be 3 or 4 paragraphs. Less than 3 paragraphs is probably too short, and certainly more than 4, maybe 5, depending upon your articles and your topic. But that's really what you're aiming to do with with the format of your literature review paper. Now, some common mistakes in writing an introduction. You're going to be writing an introduction in this unit. Your initial introduction, send it in to me. I'm going to read it very carefully and give you feedback, and hopefully you'll rewrite it again before you hand in your paper. A common mistake I see, even in students that have been writing these papers for several years, do not use the word introduction at the top of your introduction. You don't do that. You simply restate the title of your paper in the middle. Again, your introduction should have a logical flow to it, and again, avoid in your introduction presenting your 4 journal articles, one after the other. It should be unified. There should be something that you're telling me about. You're reviewing the literature in a very small area. Your review shouldn't be a series of mini journal article reviews. You should review the topic, not the journal articles. Try and get rid of the word prove from your writing vocabulary. Prove is a word, whenever I see it written or whenever I hear someone talking about, we've proved this or that, we really can't prove anything definitively. Rather, you probably want to substitute for that, and it might strike you as a little strange, but instead of the word prove, substitute for that the phrase show evidence, or the phrase, the evidence would indicate, or the evidence seems to indicate, or the evidence likely indicates. What that obviously does is it tells you where the evidence goes, but it avoids the word prove, which has the implication that there is no hint or doubt that this could possibly be true. And in science, the way science works is there's always a doubt. We always need to be questioning whether we've actually found the definitive answer. Once we get rid of doubt, we may harm ourselves by not continuing to further refine and look for the underlying evidence. The history of science, and particularly the history of psychology, is full of things we thought to be true, but later, upon further research or further considerations, whoops, we were wrong, and the research would indicate something different. You want to not use the future tense or the present tense. Past research has been done. It's not in the present. These research studies have been completed. So use the past tense when you're talking about your research findings. They have been found, not in the present, not in the future, but in the past. We mentioned earlier, avoid anthropomorphizing, avoid saying the research study found. Research studies don't find anything. Instead, simply say Smith and Jones found X, Y, and Z results. The authors are the ones that do the research. The paper or the journal article is where they present their research. So don't give human qualities to research papers. Ask yourself the question, who is doing this research? And then use their names. Again, writing a literature review is a big challenge because you're using critical thinking, you're summarizing, you're making judgments. But judgments are not opinions. Opinions are things that we write that are not backed up by evidence. And so as you write your introduction and your paper, ask yourself if the assessments or critiques that you made are your opinions or are backed up. And a very easy way to do this is when you make an assessment or a judgment as to the value of this or that, or these authors found this. If you can back it up with evidence in the journal articles, then that's an informed critique you're making. It's not a personal opinion. Now, all of us tend to think that our personal opinions are backed up by reality and the truth. and we may even articulate that. But that's the difference that between opinion and a critical judgment is. A critical judgment is immediately backed up with the reason for that, and again, a citation or two. Finally, in your interview and in your paper, you want to do everything you possibly can to avoid direct quotations. Now, I'll talk about this more in another lecture. Direct quotations are not always bad. There are particular times when a direct quotation from the journal article, or if you're writing a paper that involves books and so on and so forth, may be appropriate. But those instances are extremely narrow. So for instance, if there's a definition that you need to be very, very clear on, or if there is a famous quote that you're citing, or if the author has stated something in such a particularly beautiful and eloquent way, and you want to emphasize the clarity of that, or the beauty of that, or the fame of that. But I have to tell you that when I read literature review papers, and I've read perhaps thousands and thousands of them, one of the things that jumps out at me is when people are directly quoting, what it tells me 95% of the time is that this person does not understand and hasn't put the energy and effort into really understanding what their journal article is truly saying. And so in an effort to avoid making a mistake, this person just quotes word for word from the journal article. It's almost a big red flag for me that this is a poorly written literature review paper because this person is over quoting. So if I could encourage you, in not only this lit review paper you're writing for this course, but for most of them, use direct quotations extremely sparingly. Maybe one in an entire paper. In extreme cases, maybe two or at the most three. But if you find yourself quoting directly from your journal article, this is not a lit review paper. A lit review paper is not where you string a bunch of quotes from your journal articles together and pretend that you are explaining what the literature says. You get that. So please avoid that. That is a common mistake. Go to it.